So I want to tell you about a story, actually, and this is one of my favorite stories, I have to say, and it involves some women that I have had the privilege to work with, to study with, and to continue to be in contact with, and a group that I actually joined to, really spend my career with. So it's a happy story for me in that way. But you have to go back to 1976, and at that time I was 12 years old, playing basketball. It's really all that mattered, okay? And in Boston, in this area, there were 4 women that were thinking, coming out of the sort of 60s, the wild 60s. I don't know if they'd call themselves hippies, but certainly, change was in the air. Jean Baker Miller was a psychiatrist. All of these women were traditionally trained in a theory of human development. They were all clinicians, 3 psychologists and a psychiatrist, and they were all steeped in a tradition that said human development is towards separation and individuation. Right? And so really then, as clinicians, as psychiatrists, psychologists, their job was to help people become their fullest individual selves. Right? And they gathered together in Jean's living room to do peer supervision. People were doing peer supervision all over the country at that point, just getting together and talking about their clinical work. Most people were seeing women because women were the people that were going to psychotherapists, right? Men, it was not cool. It didn't fit into the male mystique to go off and get psychiatric help in this way. So they would be talking about their women, and in that model that believed that separation and individuation was the goal of human development, the tasks then of that were to become very linear thinking, very left brain, very logical, unemotional. You should be able to argue your point without, being reduced to tears. If you needed something, you sucked it up. Nobody paid attention to the fact that, even men at that point had somebody that they turned to. Usually it was a woman or their wives or what have you. All of that was kind of disappeared within the context of how society raised kind of partnerships, people, and they developed into partnerships. But anyway, so they would be talking about these women that they were seeing, and they very quickly noticed that the women that they saw didn't seem too sick to them, but by these measures, that said, stand on your own 2 feet, be unemotional, be disconnected, linear, logical. By that standard, they were all very sick, okay? And they then had a choice, right? And all of us, have these kind of choice points in our lives where we say, okay, we're going to go with the flow, or are we going to sort of shake it up and challenge somebody on this? And challenging at the time, you have to know, psychoanalysis in New York and Boston was strong and powerful. And, it was not something that you're going to challenge lightly. Despite that, these 4 women from very privileged backgrounds, all of them, these were white women, well-educated. They decided to challenge. And the challenge was this. They were going to say, I don't think these women are as sick as these models are talking about. And you know what? Maybe the model doesn't fit women. And so a relatively small theory of female development came out of this group. The group was originally called the Stone Center, and really it was about empowering women through a different model of health and development that really focused on relationships being central. And so skills that women had, seemingly at birth, empathy, the capacity to be in mutual relationships, the ability to communicate, were strengths. They weren't weaknesses, they were strengths. So it really upended the traditional model of human development. Now, originally, and I love to hear Judy particularly talk about that. Unfortunately, Jean and Irene have already died, but I love to hear her talk about the reaction that people had, right, in the environment. You'd expect people to start going crazy and being angry and all of that, and of course they didn't. They just didn't care, right? And that's the ultimate sign of being disempowered, right? So there was some ridiculing, there was some, that makes no sense, that doesn't fit any of the empirical data. And then ultimately, for a very long time, they were dismissed. Despite that, they pressed on, and they built a community. They built a community of other women and occasionally men that really would hear the stories and hear a different kind of human development and say, geez, that felt right. That feels more like what I do in my office, but I don't want to say it, because if I say it, my supervisor is going to say that I'm wrong, right? Empathy at that time, and empathy was literally thought of as a contagion. A contagion. If you're empathic in the therapy hour in 1976, you're doing bad therapy. It, of course, has come, I think, in almost every therapeutic office now. It's sort of the cornerstone of what heals, right? The ability to be empathic with somebody else's pain and suffering. So the theory built, and I remember when I came on board about 15 years ago, I came from the field of trauma. I had worked for at that point, probably 10 years in the field of trauma. I got very interested in the neurophysiology of trauma and the neurobiology of trauma. And what was happening is new techniques were being developed that actually allowed us to look at the brain and sort of see what was happening in people's minds and in their bodies during, different kinds of behaviors, interactions. And so, a whole new field of study emerged. Some of it was called interpersonal neurobiology, but I loved this stuff. And so I took it upon myself to sort of gather all of the information I could, read, and bring this into relational cultural theory. What I remember, is that it wasn't easy, because everything that had been written about the science was interpreted through the lens of separation and individuation. And I can remember one whole summer where I read a book by an attachment theorist, Alan Shore. It's about this thick, and you have to read every single thing. And I literally read it through the lens of RCT. What would that data look like if you were looking at it through relationship rather than separation? It took a lot of work. But, it was really instrumental in sort of shifting and validating kind of what was what RCT was, right? And now there are groups, interpersonal neurobiology. Here at the center, we talk about relational neuroscience that really continues to follow this growing scientific evidence that we are hardwired to connect, and that we function best when we are in healthy, harmonious, mutual relationships. We are literally healthier. We are literally happier. And I remember one of my favorite poignant moments with Jean Baker Miller, who was just a pioneer in the field of mental health. When I visited her as she was dying, I remember sitting beside her bed, literally, and her just saying in a very understated way, Amy, the neurobiology, it's really important, And I think she knew that it was going to be the thing that allowed RCT to break out of the feminist little prison that it had, in a sense. It was going to allow other people to see the work and see how powerful it is. This body of work that's been growing for over 30 years. People who speak the language of science could now look at this and say, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense.